Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Maoist-Third Worldist Collective, and you are invited to join us. Today, I wanted to discuss Georg Simmel's formal sociology. Discuss both of those first. Georg Simmel was a German sociologist, as you can probably tell from the pronunciation of Georg rather than George, Georg, with no E at the end. Georg Simmel was an associate of Max Weber's. They knew each other fairly well. Their approaches to sociology, while different in many respects, also had a number of similarities. In other words, they were both, for example, very strongly influenced by German idealism. German idealism goes back to Immanuel Kant and to progress through Hegel and so forth. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, for example, challenged German idealism, and they rejected it completely. And they argued for a materialist approach to reality rather than an ontologically idealist approach where mind was the centerpiece of reality. That is what Karl Marx rejected. Well, to one extent or another, both Weber and Simmel accepted various forms of ontological idealism. Second, what is formal sociology? Formal sociology does not mean formal as in formal versus informal. So a formal sociologist is not somebody who tips the hat. That's not what it means. Formal sociology is the sociological study of forms of social behavior, or forms of social groups, or forms of social conduct. Any way you want to put it, it is the study of social forms. That is basically what Georg Simmel's sociology was devoted to, understanding the different forms that exist in the social world. The two most basic forms he discussed, which I would imagine everyone has heard of, the dyad and the triad. If you have heard those terms and have ever wondered, where do they come from? They come from Simmel. A dyad, a group of two, a triad, a group of three, but they are more significant than two and three to Simmel. If you have a dyad, there is going to be increased intimacy, as in the expression, two's company, three's a crowd. The more people you add to a group, the less informal it becomes, because you have more people involved in the group. The fewer people that you have in a group, the more informal it becomes. And the lowest level of group you can have is a dyad, because one person is not a group. Group has to be at least two people. So a dyad is very informal, but it is not necessarily very permanent. Say you have an election and you have two people with competing views, and they both vote on different sides. What do? You have nobody to break the tie. And so there is an impasse. And often the group will fall apart. But if you have a triad, group of three, there is more permanence. And so if you have that third person can break the tie. That third person can also add somewhat more stability to the group. But on the other hand, because triads are three, not two, they are less informal or more formal than dyads are. So that's one of the basic aspects of Simmel's formal sociology, although it is not one that we will be focusing on in this particular podcast. I don't really see how that is relevant exactly to Maoism-Third Worldism. What we will be talking about are Simmel's concepts of association and dissociation. He put those terms under the broad heading of sociation, a term which is not commonly used. So when you hear the word sociation, that usually means you're talking about something connected with Simmel's formal sociology. Sociation refers to patterns of relationship which exist within groups. Association refers to association which is magnetic in a sense. Members of the group want to be with each other. They derive pleasure from being with each other. They would rather be with each other than be with other people. So, for example, a well-functioning family, a family where people actually love each other, that would negate my family of orientation or origin. That was not a well-functioning family at all by any stretch of the imagination. But some families, I guess, are well-functioning, although I have no personal experience with that, unfortunately. And in that kind of a case, you would have association, because people would actually prefer to be with each other than with outsiders. And so there might be more trust, might be more of a sense of likability, a sense of emotionality, where you literally feel stronger positive emotions being with members of your group than you do elsewhere. And so people don't generally have to coax you into being with a group that is in association with you. You will automatically want to be with them because you are in association with them. You have a kind of magnetic attachment to them. You're attracted to them. You genuinely like being around them. That's association. Now, dissociation, a less common term, but a genuine dictionary term nonetheless, is the opposite of association. So whereas in association, people are magnetically attracted to one another, in dissociation, people are repelled from one another. People literally may belong to the same group, but they don't like each other. That is a pretty good description of my family of orientation, my family of origin. We were, I guess, a group in some sense, but most of us, most of the time, did not like each other very much, with some exceptions. But generally speaking, we were not what most people today would call a functional family. We were a dysfunctional family, to borrow the common term used in psychology. So with true association, the people that you are around in your group are people that you want to be around. Nobody has to make you be with them. They are people that you like, maybe people that you love. If you have a choice to be with anybody, you will be with them. With dissociation, on the other hand, you would rather be with anybody else except them. But perhaps you're still a group. Good example. Say you are in a company and you work in an office. You are by definition in a work group, okay? A work group. But what if the people in the work group don't really like each other that much? There's a lot of tension between the people in that group. Well, there's no association then. as Simmel would call it. Instead, there is dissociation, or a kind of repugnance. You are literally offended by the presence of the other people in your group. There's no place that you would rather be than some place where these folks aren't. As an example, when I was an undergraduate student at the University of Georgia, my major was journalism, but my minor was sociology, which ended up becoming my field for my master's and my PhD. But at that time, it was only my minor. Although if I would have stayed an additional term at the University of Georgia, I could have actually gotten 2 degrees, an ABJ, Bachelor of Arts in Journalism, and a BA, a Bachelor of Arts. But I didn't care. I had no need to do that. What was the point? I was going to graduate school anyway. So I think I justifiably made the choice not to stay around for another term, which at that time was called a quarter. Now it would be called a semester at University of Georgia, and to go back up to New York, where I finished up my master's degree at CW Post campus of Long Island University, and then eventually migrated back down south to Mississippi State University, where I got my PhD. So there was at University of Georgia, in the sociology department, tremendous animosity between faculty. There were 2 groups of faculty. One were called the Sunshine Boys. Not a very nice term in the way it was used. And the other, I don't know what they were called. Maybe the old timers. I don't know if there was actually a name for them, but we'll call them the old timers for the sake of this podcast. The old timers were people who had been around the sociology department for a long, long time. Many of them were into qualitative research, like participant observation. Many of them were social theorists, like my good friend Drennan Kelly, who I later met when I became a professor at Middle Georgia State University. And at that time, we were colleagues. Before that, I was a student. And so it was nice meeting him as a colleague later on. I really liked Drennan. He was a great guy, had a magnificent spirit. I admired him tremendously. He was brilliant. He was one of the old timers, but he tried to be as neutral as he possibly could, meaning he tried to avoid taking sides. There were some people who took sides, a lot of people who took sides. Among the old timers, they were people who were angry at the Sunshine Boys, and I'll get to them in a moment, for taking all the top committee appointments. One of the less well-known things to people who are not academics about academic life is serving on committees. You want to be on the top committees. You want to be, or at least most people do. Did I really care? No. So I guess I was odd. But most professors want to be on the top ranked committees. It is a way that you gain prestige at the university or college. And so because these Sunshine Boys had shown up, all of the old timers got kicked off their positions on the committees and were replaced by the Sunshine Boys. Now, who, you might ask, were the Sunshine Boys? Well, I will try to answer that for you. They were the quantitative sociologists. Many of them had gotten their PhDs from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which had a very strong quantitative research focus. But other places too, not only North Carolina at Chapel Hill, other places as well. But they were the people who really wanted to bring sociology into what was generally called at that time, this term has kind of faded away, but neo-positivism, which means basically a very empirical and quantitative approach to sociology. If you read a paper written by one of these sunshine boys, which obviously they did not call themselves, that was an insult, then you would see loads of charts, loads of tables, loads of diagrams, and loads of statistical formulas. That's basically what you would find in the papers written by the Sunshine Boys. Now, why were they called the Sunshine Boys? They were called the Sunshine Boys because the old timers basically said, well, these people aren't getting their hands dirty. They aren't going out into the field and doing real research, actually meeting people like we are. Instead, they are sitting in their offices behind desks and hiring people to go out and do survey research. In case you didn't know, survey research is not done directly by sociologists, usually. It is done by people hired by sociologists. Often they're students, sometimes they're members of the community, but they can be anybody, just people that are hired by the sociologist, usually using grant money. And they will knock on doors, they will call people up on the phones, they will do other kinds of things that will basically free the sociologist to sit in her or his classroom. And then afterwards, after the initial analysis is done, we'll do the final analysis and write the paper. So that is why they were called the Sunshine Boys, because the idea being that they would be laying out in the sunshine all the time, and we're not really doing any work. Now, was that true? No, not really. Wasn't really true. But you can understand why they got called that. It was a way of getting back at them. There was a lot of anger, or to use Simmel's term, a lot of dissociation in the University of Georgia sociology department of the 1970s and at least the early 1980s. I don't know what the situation is there now, but if I had to guess, that situation no longer exists because the old timers are gone, they've retired, or they died, and the people who are there now are all new people who use new methods of research. And so the kinds of conflicts, or as they were sometimes called, the sociology wars of that time have long since dissipated. Okay. So that's sociation, right? Association meaning association based on attractiveness, magnetism, and dissociation, which is association based on repulsion. People are in the same group, like in the same university department, but they don't like each other. They don't want to be there, and yet they are forced to work with each other, but not because they want to, because they have to, because it is a part of their jobs. Okay, so that is a brief summary, which is actually pretty similar to the summary I used to give to my students of Georg Simmel's Sociation. So you had a taste of the way I presented the subject to my students. You are free to judge me badly if you want, but regardless, that is basically how I talked about it in my classes, in my lectures. So how could we take this and relate it to Maoism-Third Worldism? Well, if we look at the relationship currently between the first world and the third world, we could say, in a sense, that it is a relationship of dissociation, right? Antagonism. even relationships in the third world are often antagonistic. But I came across this story today, really horrendous story. It's not one that brought me any pleasure, but then again, the news for the last few months has not been very, very enjoyable, I don't think, for most of us. But it said that there might actually now be another war between Israel and Egypt. Just when people thought that Israel and Egypt were at peace for several decades, now there might be another war between them. And now there might be a war between Israel and Hezbollah. And again, Israel is bombing Lebanon. So what is this monstrosity of Israel? And why is Israel doing this? Well, one of the reasons is because of the concept which some Jews, not all Jews, accept, called the chosen people. Again, Orthodox Jews accept it, conservative Jews accept it, Reform Jews accept a modified version of it, Reconstructionist Jews do not accept it at all. The problem with the concept of the chosen people is that it is not biblical. Literally, use a concordance. Try to find the term chosen people anywhere in the Tanakh, which is the Jewish word for what Christians call the Old Testament. You won't find it. Why? Because it's not there. It's not there. It's made up. Who made it up? I don't know. I would assume it was made up by rabbis. I assume it was made up by rabbis after the exile, the diaspora in 70 AD, when Jews were forced to flee Jerusalem after the destruction of the Second Temple, and Judaism had to be entirely reworked because there was no more temple, and pre-exilic Judaism was based on the temple. So the rabbis literally had to construct a new form of Judaism. So what people think of today as Orthodox Judaism, or actually there are many different Orthodox Judaisms, but regardless, Orthodox Judaism is not biblical Judaism. Biblical Judaism cannot be practiced today because there is no temple. I would assume then that the chosen people concept originated in the ghetto. People like me from a Jewish background who don't like Orthodox Judaism will often call it ghetto Judaism. Obviously, that's kind of a disparaging term. If I were a Christian from a Christian background, I would not use it. I might think it, but I wouldn't use it. But as somebody from a Jewish background, I think I am perfectly justified in using it. It is a commonly used term among people who don't like Orthodox Judaism, especially liberal Jews, which would include, as they're called in the US, Reform Judaism and Reconstructionist Judaism, or as Reconstructionist is now called, Reconstructing Judaism, whatever. So the idea of chosen people is not biblical. There's no biblical basis for it. The closest term you can find in the Tanakh, the Old Testament, to chosen people is treasured people. That's it. It never says that the Jews are a chosen people. Never. And yet somehow that idea has become a part not only of Jewish popular culture, but of Jewish rabbinical culture. Because I've read works by rabbis, not uneducated people, who refer to Jews as God's chosen people. even though that term is nowhere used in the Bible. Is it used in the Talmud? I don't know. But as far as I know, the answer to that question is also no. If I am wrong, then I'm wrong. Correct me. I'm willing to be corrected. But as far as I know, Jews are not called the chosen people in the Talmud either. It's a completely made up concept. But then again, the Talmud is also completely made up. Basically, all the rabbis got together after the diaspora in 70 AD and they said, gee, we've got to create a new Judaism because the old Judaism doesn't work anymore. There is no more temple. There are no more tithes to the temple. And so they did. They created a brand new Judaism, which is the Judaism that is in the Talmud. Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews to a lesser extent, traditional Jews almost the same as Orthodox Jews, conservative Jews to a lesser extent, Reformed Jews to a lesser extent, and Reconstructionist Jews usually not at all, or at least very minimally, accept the Talmud to those degrees. So the Talmud, if you read it, just pick up a chapter from it, if you're curious about it. What it is a collection of arguments between rabbis. That's all it is, a collection of arguments between rabbis, nothing more. Now, how they managed to go from the arguments to rabbis to the dogmas of ghetto Judaism is beyond me. I don't understand it. But it's not for me to understand. I'm not a part of that tradition. Really never have been, even though I was born into a non-practicing Jewish family. And I was bar mitzvahed, basically because my friends were bar mitzvahed. And so I didn't want to be left out. So since my upstairs neighbor Barry was being bar mitzvahed, I thought, well, I guess I should be bar mitzvahed too. And there was a Hebrew school in the neighborhood called Joel Bernstein's Hebrew School in walking distance from my home that we went to, which was actually held in kind of an extension to Joel's home. And we all went there and got instruction from him, and also got a lot of other prizes and transistor radios and cassette tapes and all sorts of interesting things like that. Walkie-talkies. I remember getting a walkie-talkie from Joel one time. Actually, we called him Mr. Bernstein, but I think now I can get away with calling him Joel. In any event, if you look at the third world and the fourth world, you can see the tremendous dissociation which exists between those two segments of the world. And I think that association and dissociation in that sense are fairly similar to Roy Bhaskar's concept of demi-reality and co-presence. Demi-reality, disunity, illusion; co-presence, unity. They're pretty close, not exactly the same. Both were approaching the subject of human groups from a different perspective, but I think that aspects of homo sociology are certainly compatible with some things in critical realism. Although I am not a formal sociologist myself, far from it, in fact. But I respect much of the work of Simmel. So I think that if we look at the world today using Simmel's formal sociology, we can see a world that is overrun by dissociation. And if we want to see a world of communism in the future, then we need to talk about how do we create a world of association. And in my opinion, as I've said many times before, that can only be done, at least initially, by the third world. Will they do it? I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a prophet. I, I have no way of knowing if the third world will rise to that challenge. But if they don't do it, I simply don't see any other way in which it can be accomplished. Really. I know that's negative. I know that's pessimistic, but if you have a better answer to that question, please answer it for me. Again, I say, create a response video, challenge me, critique me, throw me under the carpet. I don't care. Just be relatively nice. I guess that's contradictory to throw me under the carpet, but whatever. Nicely throw me under the carpet, and I will respond to you, and hopefully we can have a meaningful dialogue, and in the end come up with some really good ideas that can help the world at this stage of tremendous crisis. Because I honestly, and this is from the bottom of my heart, I honestly do not feel, given the level of dissociation or demi-reality in the world today, that the first world, which is pretty much synonymous with the capitalist world system, has that much longer to go. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I will live out my life into my 80s or 90s, probably not 90s. My father died when he was 89. But maybe, who knows? I hope not. Because I don't want to live sickly or in assisted living or worse. Well, I wouldn't be in a nursing home because of my wealth. But even so, I mean, that's not my idea of a good life. I don't want to live like that at all. So if there is a way to avoid that, I hope that we can come up with one, but I don't see one. And so for that reason, I actually hope for calamity. I hope for destruction. I hope for an end to the first world, because this dissociation, I think, is simply intolerable and cannot really last much longer. This has been Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Maoist-Third Worldist Collective. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.